will now present 3 questions. And as we got together prior to this day to decide what to present to you, we crafted 3 questions that are all centered around the assets that art education provides exclusively to students. Math education has its assets, different areas of different disciplines have their assets, but we feel like the assets that art education, that artists and students in art classes learn are unique and particularly relevant and actually very sought after today, not only in the creative economy, but in industry in general. So we'll start with the first question, which is centered around the idea of, in the classroom, the critique, how critiques are generally managed, handled, how you talk about things that are ambiguous, things that are open-ended, metaphoric like art is. And the question itself is, how do you evaluate work that is primarily subjective? And also think too about these questions being maybe specific to art classrooms, but also germane to life. So there's that realm between what you learn and how you apply it in life. So does anyone want to start with that one?
Sure.
Mike, thank you.
Yeah, I'll start and then pass it around for some more discussion. I think this is great. This question comes up more in my life today than it ever has in the past. So as I mentioned, engineering, which meant a lot of math and a lot of defined answers. Corporate world, a lot of times the way you get ahead is to follow a very defined path and a very defined set of cultural norms. And actually I found that to be very easy. If I wanted to get ahead, I could follow the norms very precisely, and there I was. But now I'm in a world of complete ambiguity. There are no answers. And it's also a world where people seem to think less in general. And I'm not talking about creative thinking or analytical thinking. I'm talking about thinking boiled down just to thinking. So I like to play games with my friends, and I actually but talked about this when we were discussing the panel, is like just sitting around and asking people, what altitude did the Hindenburg fly at? You know, the blimp thing that exploded whenever that was. And the natural way to solve that problem is to get out your phone and look at Google and just find the answer within 30 seconds, which is fine if you were in a time crunch and money was on the line, but you didn't make your brain work at all. And the answers that I'm trying to solve in a business, some of them are typical business questions, but most of them, there are no answers. And so what I'm relying upon in my life is I'm relying more upon the other side of critical thinking that has to come in with new alternative, what do you call it, outside the box or whatever the right terminology is, ways to solve problems that have never been solved before. And I was thinking about on the drive over here, because my girlfriend asked me where I was going, and I gave a little blur. I'm going to talk to art teachers about, why it's so important. And I also told her that I'm still in love with my 4th grade art teacher, which is, I'll admit. And I tried to sum it up as fast as I could as I walked out the door, and I think is really relevant. I said, I'm going to hopefully convince them that I truly believe that if I'm going to work out my body, I would never just work out my left arm only and just pump weights on my left arm. And for a long time, that's all I did. I was an engineering student. That's all I did. I did math all day long. And I became not a complete thinker in my mind. And it took a lot of external influences in school. I had to force myself to go and be a part of different organizations to get different stimulus. And thank God I did that, because it helped me, not get 100% pigeonholed into an analytical mindset and kept my mind free thinking. And so then I could always exercise the other half of my brain. And so I played high school football, and I think it's a very relevant topic of like, well, what benefit did you get out of that? I got a lot out of it. I will never play football. In fact, I threw the football over the weekend, and it was embarrassing. But I still use skills that I learned playing high school football, and I still use skills that I learned in automotive class in high school, and I still use skills that I learned in photography class in high school, and I still use skills that had nothing to do with engineering to solve engineering related or business problems. And so this notion of whether there's a right answer or a wrong answer, there isn't one. There's an undefined answer that takes your whole life's perspective to bring it home. And if you're only working out one side of your body, how in the hell can you have a good perspective on the answer?
Hey, Mike, I think you bring up a good thing. There's no right answer. I actually think there's thousands of answers. And what the right answer is depends on your point of view, your perspective, what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that's what makes looking at something that's subjective difficult, because the perspective of the person matters as much as the thing that they've created. And that's hard. So where do you start to evaluate that? Well, in design thinking, it's a very analogous situation. Design thinking gives you many options that you never considered before, and there's not a right answer. There's just lots of better answers. So which one is the right answer? It all depends. What's your objective? What situation are you in? What's the context? What are you trying to do? What do you like? Okay, all those things factor in. So a lot of times I think in subjective things, really it has to do with the perspective of the person, and it has to do with the impact they hope to have. And so there isn't a right answer, and a lot of times you evaluate a subjective thing, I think, after it's created. When I was in business school, we'd read these case studies, and we would read them, and we had to boil it down to 3 alternatives and pick the best and argue why that was the best. And that's analytical thinking at its best, and I was really good at it. But, there were always considerations that never even entered into the dialogue because they were complications that they didn't want to have in the case study. They were ambiguities that got kind of edited out to simplify it. Life is not simple. When I got out of business school and started at P&G, there were no tables with all the data present. There was, it wasn't like business school where everything had been simplified to 3 alternatives and pick the right answer. There were so many trade-offs, so many tensions, so many things that were in conflict with one another, that perspective and what desired impact you wanted to have were really the defining moments. I think art teaches you a lot about that. I think in art, you have to look at something that's ambiguous and chaotic and take a point of view. And that point of view impacts how you judge whether or not what you've done is right or not. And it's only after you create it that you can look at it and say, yeah, that's it. Or, boy, did I really miss the mark. I know it now that I've done it. I need to take a different stance. So to me, that's what makes it so hard for people, because there's no perfect rubric of you can paint by numbers and have a terrible painting. And I think in business, you can do business by numbers and do the checklist and have a terrible business decision, because rarely is that actually what's going on. So the skill of looking at chaos and ambiguity, taking a perspective, and then doing it to see what that reveals and judging it after the fact, that's the reality of business today. And that skill that you train kids to do when they're working on art is a skill that can be reapplied many, many places. So that's how I judge. Unfortunately, it's after the fact, but I think that's reality. Yeah.
I don't have too much to add to what Cindy said. She said I think you said the word intent, or came close to it. That was where my mind kind of stopped on the question. How do you objectively assess something that is subjective inherently? And so I think that it becomes a question and answer exercise where you should know and should ask, what was your intent? And once you know that, you can, of course, start to objectively say whether or not that was achieved. Not your opinion on whether you like it or not, just was it achieved. I actually wanted to bring, just because I thought it would be fun, something I learned literally this week. So my team has had, so I'm new, I mentioned, to my role. The team is going through a phrase that you may or may not have heard of: forming, storming, norming, performing. So as you can, forming, storming, norming, performing. So as you can imagine, forming, you get together, right? Storming, gravity takes hold, and all the bad habits and whatever, and the honeymoon's over, and the bad habits start to show up, and the resentments and whatever, and then hopefully you move on to kind of normalizing, norming, and then you become a well-oiled machine and you start performing. Well, clearly we have been in the storming phase lately, and so what I found fun this week was as I scheduled a feedback loop discussion with somebody whom I respect in the Human Resources Department, and she coached us on something that I hadn't heard to date, and it was one little concept, and it was, when you are critiquing something, start with the positive, okay, I knew that, and then go to the constructive criticism, but, and I'm using the word but, don't use the word but or however, because it instantaneously negates anything positive you said. So don't say, I like the way you did that, blah, 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 but, well, that's the end of that. They knew that you didn't mean a damn word you said. So I thought I'd throw that into the mix today. The other thing is I didn't go deep on this, but I also thought it might be interesting to just say out loud, and then let's also consider flipping the whole thing on its head, which is, how should your students receive feedback? And that might be something to kind of dig a little deeper into in your own worlds. Just how can they turn it into a positive, things like that. I think that might be interesting to think about another time.
Jordan, you said something earlier in your comments when you were introducing yourself about curiosity. And I think the feedback in a subjective space is all about the curious mindset. And you said you've been a curious person. I like this, but if you say I like this, tell me more about why you chose this subject. Why did you choose this composition? I mean, I think that's a very different way of having a feedback conversation to get the learning. And as a person that's receiving feedback, if I can, the analogy that I like to think of is people have feedback to offer and they're offering it to you. You need to become curious, you don't need to accept, okay? Like feedback's a gift, but you don't have to accept it. And so someone's giving me feedback, I try to become curious to really understand where they're coming from, especially in subjective matters, because the more subjective it is, the more it might link to something underneath the surface that is something we actually need to deal with, right? And so by becoming curious and listening to the feedback, I'm trying it on. But I may not buy the coat. I may not take the gift. I may actually say, I understand where you're coming from, but no, this is my intent. This is what I was trying to do. I appreciate your feedback. I wanted to accomplish this. And I think that kind of back and forth, from what I can tell, my husband's an architect, and he taught for a while in architecture school and did the critiques. And as I observed him teaching a couple of times, I think that's what was going on there, is they were having these very intense conversations, but they were very curious and explorative in nature, even though at the time I was like, I can't believe you questioned that person on their intent on why they did blah, blah, blah in the building. And he was like, no, this is how we learn from each other and how we really understand whether we've achieved what we wanted to achieve. So it was through watching him really that I started to really follow into what you were saying about feedback is not a but, and it's not a judgment. It's more of a exploration together, a curiosity.
Yeah, just quickly add on to that. My very first boss at a school saved my butt in my career, because before there's kind of a honeymoon period when you get started. There's some training and stuff. You don't have to produce any results. And during that time period, she spent a lot of time with me and said, this company is really big on feedback. And it's whatever, what does that mean? She said, no. People will give you feedback on everything. No matter what you're doing, you're going to get a tremendous amount of feedback, and you need to be prepared for that, and not only prepared to give it when you're managing others, but you have to really be prepared to accept it and do something with it, because this progression and through the corporate ladder is going to be about relationships. And if you're taking feedback, and as people are trying to quote unquote make you better by the feedback, which I actually, if you believe they are, the acceptance of it is amazing. If you're like, whoa, standoffish and trying to make excuses or a bunch of things you can do and not even realize you're doing it, you can get in a hole pretty quick. And she took the time to explain it to me. And when it started coming at me full force, when I got into actually working, I was terrible at receiving feedback, because I had spent the last 5 years of my life answering problems, that had no real feedback to them. It's easy to say the answer is wrong, try again harder next time. But what if there is, like the first part of the question, what if there is no real answer? It's like, I was a civil engineer, so building a bridge, building a road, like, okay, did you build it and it was structurally sound so that it didn't fall down? No, okay, try again. Like, there's no feedback on that, right? So now I was getting people giving me tremendous amount of feedback on everyday activities, and if I hadn't have been coached by my first boss, I would have started my career because I had never had the experience of receiving feedback in a much different spot.
Yeah. And I think, too, artists, they're comfortable living in this realm of ambiguity. The gray areas are the areas they live in, they're comfortable with. And so if the problem they're trying to solve, if they're in a team, a divergent team of thinkers, they're going to be the ones that are going to be able to manage the team through the questions that don't have right and wrong answers, which many questions don't these days.
Yeah.
So, but to bring that to point, that's an asset that we teach, that we take probably for granted often. And in the critique, I think, critical thinking, communication skill, oral communication skills, these are assets that we teach all the time in an art classroom, in an art studio, that we take for granted but are really important. The second question, which is all about risk-taking. Another realm that I think artists are very comfortable with. And let's set this up this way. So risk-taking and failure are comfortable places for artists to both live in and thrive in. As Sir Kenneth Robinson asserts, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has the most popular TED Talk on YouTube, if you're interested. His quote is, "If you aren't prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original." That's the premise of the question that we're going to ask now for the panel. What role does risk-taking and failure play in all aspects of life? Anyone want to start with that one? Yeah. Jordan? Okay.
Sure, looks like I got that one.
Looks like you got it.
Well, it reminds me of a quote from Edison, which is someone, I believe it said something like, how does it feel? How do you wake up every day dealing with the fact that you've failed so many times? And his reply was, actually, I didn't fail a lot of times. I found 10,000 ways not to do something. And so I think that's always spoken to me, that quote, because if you don't try, actually, no, let me back that up. What I say to my son, who's 14 now, but I say it to him all the time, I've said it to him his whole life, is, and now he knows the answer. I say, when do you fail? And he says, I know, when I quit. And that's the answer. You only fail when you quit. Otherwise, you're just finding 10,000 ways not to do it. And so my particular journey, as I shared with you all a little bit ago, has been a series of ways not to do it. But I think one thing that's been interesting is my ability to reinvent. And I think that came from my art background, my background in the creative arts, in that I was never, ever taught to be afraid of trying something. In fact, I had a music coach, who in one of the areas that I specialized in was Baroque music. I was a flutist. And Baroque music, if you don't know, has a lot of improvisation. It actually originally was just kind of a skeletal outline of chord structure. And then the musician went ahead and injected their creativity into it. Then they basically improvised like a jazz musician just a couple hundred years ago. And so he had a little phrase. He said, I want you to try something. He said, and if it doesn't work out well, he said, you're sorry. And that's all he ever said. He just said, you're sorry. And that's great. And then you move on. And of course, I brought it into the entrepreneurship world, and then I brought it into Startup Cincy. And it's something that startups, and Mike can speak to this a lot about, it's called failing fast. No problem failing. Just do it quickly. Learn from it. Pivot if you have to. If it had good legs, then rinse and repeat. Go on, go forth and multiply. But never be afraid to make a mistake. To your point, to that quote, that's where innovation happens.
Do you mind if I build on that, just because you brought my name up, so I feel like I have to defend myself or something? It's weird. So I hang out just about every day with people that are in the same shoes as I'm in, not Pumas, but starting their own businesses that hopefully scale to be, $100 million businesses. And it's funny how little this is discussed because they've got it. Like, you think you have to almost, if you're in that game, long ago you decided that I have, skin that can take any amount of quote unquote failure. You're not gonna, you do just try, and things, you have usually an uncanny brain for observing when something is in its very early stage of success and then driving energy behind it. But to get there, you tried 20 other things that were catastrophically an error in strategy or an error in judgment, but you had to keep moving. Like a death of a startup in a small business is standing still, because people will go right past you at warp speed, and if you're just standing still, it's all over. So even if you're doing the wrong thing, you got to be doing something sometimes, which is a strange concept, but it isn't to founders of young companies. But I wanted to share a story that actually happened. I'm sharing a lot of college stories, but I took one class in college, and I remember like almost every single day of it. It's called Creative Dramatics, and I had to take an elective. A friend told me I should take this one, and one of the projects came into the class, and they said, this week you're going to build your own stick puppets out of twigs. So they had a bunch of sticks off of trees, and you had to build your own puppets using those, and then you had to put on a performance with the puppet. And I was freaking out because I wanted to know what I'd be evaluated on. I wanted to know how many sticks I had to use. Could I break the sticks? Could I use any other outside material? I had so many questions, and my heart rate went down when the teacher explained that my grade would solely be based on my explanation of the process. And that, again, there was no right way to build a puppet. There was no wrong way to build. There was no right way to give a performance based on the puppet. That was all new to me. Is like you can shut down a lot of non-creative thinkers by putting a whiteboard in front of them and saying, okay, let's start thinking about the answer, and it's a complete whiteboard. But to an artist or someone who routinely has to do this, that skill is built, and it is such a valuable skill. And that's the way I have this notion of building a puppet and putting it on performance was like this whiteboard, and I didn't have this skill to know what to do next. And it was until I was put at ease by the instructor about, I wasn't going to fail the class because I built a crappy puppet, I was able to then put all those things aside and start actually working on something I had never ever done before in my life. So it was a cool experience, and just another example of if I had never had that training, I would be failing at entrepreneurship today.
There's a concept that you all are talking about a little bit about improvisation and willing to take a risk, and I think the problems that we face today in the world, whether in the social sector or in the business sector, are often not just puzzles that have a simple answer to them. And so they do need creativity. But I want to put a tension on that, which is I think that creativity has to have something underpinning it. And so there's a discipline underneath that has to be understood before you improvise. Before you could be a great Baroque flautist and improvise, you had to understand Baroque music. You had to understand the flute. There's a craft that has to be built in any discipline, and then there's the improvisation of risk-taking that has to happen. I think, though, sometimes people think, oh, I'll just try anything, and they have no underpinning, and I think that's when it gets kind of dangerous. So I think failing fast is something in design thinking we talk a lot about. It's a really good principle of trying to get the idea crystallized quickly so you can get feedback on it and have a curious conversation on it. However, what I've seen is sometimes people don't understand the underpinnings of the business, of design thinking, of the subject matter, and so they don't have the grounds to improvise. And so when you're teaching art, I think there's an important thing to teach the skill and the craft of art, and then to release your students to explore. But I do think there has to be the grounding first. And so I love improvisation, but you said it's after a career of, your circuitous career and all your experiences, and you said the same thing. Yes, because you had the discipline underneath. It doesn't matter what the discipline is, really, in terms of an individual skill, whether it be music or art or engineering or business, but just this notion that I understand how things work, and then I'm willing to let go of those to explore. But I think it requires both. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think personal growth and artistic growth only comes from the kinds of experiences you get from either taking a risk or failing. Because to do that, you leave your comfort zone, what you know. You're not demonstrating what you know anymore. You're trying something different. You're exploring or discovering. And if it doesn't work out, you always bring that experience back to what you know.
And the learning from the failure is worth the failure. I mean, I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that it was only in my career when I was 10 years in at P&G out of my 24 that I started caring about succeeding, that I actually started succeeding. I mean, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It's only when I let go of my fear of failure that I did major things for the company.
Yeah.
Up to that point, I was too timid. The first couple of years, I'm learning like where the bathroom is and what the principles are. But after that, I should have been pushing a lot earlier.
Yeah, I teach a class, a foundation class to freshmen. The first 6 assignments, we call them exercises, and they aren't graded at all. We encourage discovery and exploration. Those are the 2 objectives in these 6 assignments. And we get more amazing results from those 6 assignments than we do the major assignments which follow, where they have to apply what they learned in the exercises and they're graded on. Then they start asking things like, are we allowed to? Yeah, you're allowed to do that. They don't ask that when they're not being graded. So I think consequences, it's a dynamic situation when you're talking about encouraging risk-taking or building that into, part of a curriculum.
Well, and I think you even said, like, they wanted to hear your process. They didn't care about how successful the puppet was. I mean, that allowed you to totally push out. I think a lot of the questions, I just blogged on this recently, is the questions we ask that get the behavior we either want or don't want. We should pay attention to our questions.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, we'll move on to the third question. This one we saved it for last because it probably has the most takeaways. And I'll set the question up and we'll talk about this. It has a lot of what we've already talked about. We'll maybe use it to kind of sum up our thoughts. The arts teach specific sets of skills, and we might think of the skills as also assets, processes and theories that are unique to the arts, and in particular unique to the visual arts. Some of these skills are now highly coveted by business and industry to innovate, problem solve, strategize, and manage. The question is, what are transferable skills taught in the visual arts that are relevant in today's economies? Start with that?
I think there's so many, and design thinking really enabled me to see this. As I went on my journey to learn design thinking, I went to DAP, UC's Design, Art, Architecture, and Planning School, and shadowed some classes, and then I went to Stanford D School and IDEO, which is a pretty famous design firm, to just see what was going on in those spaces and how they looked at things. And the skills I saw there that were so powerful, I mentioned one already, the discipline, improvisation, tension, and being able to live on both sides of that is really interesting. It's a really interesting skill that comes out of art. The other skill that we've talked a lot about is curiosity. The one that maybe we haven't actually named yet, that is to me the biggest skill in business that comes out of art, is being able to frame something when it's ambiguous. To be able to define a point of view on something, to me, is a major skill in business. It is the gift of design thinking to corporate America. When I work with CEOs and CMOs of companies, the thing they covet the most out of this process is the ability to look at an ambiguous problem and start to see ways to frame it. It's the ability the artist has to look at a blank canvas or a blob of clay and to see possibilities in it. That skill is coveted today in business because that's deciding how you set it up, how you look at it, what perspective you take, has such an impact on the outcome. So to me, framing is that skill that we haven't really talked
And you
yet.
referred to that when we were preparing for this as the artist's ability to see the white spaces.
Yeah.
I love that because because we talk about negative space in art, and it's true. To be able to, when you design the positive and the negative, and to be able to
Which
see
business
that
only
negative,
teaches you the positive.
That's right. Yeah, right, yeah.
But art teaches you both.
That's right.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
exactly right.
Mike?
I think I touched on, you said it's kind of a summary, so I'll try to summarize something I already said, but I believe it's really important in my success, which is the notion of having a healthy brain means that both sides are healthy, and I think it's as simple as that. I don't think it has to be any more complicated than that. You can put a team together that supplements that skill, so you can have very polar opposite skills on a team, and somehow you can bring it all together because one person's analytical and one person's creative, but to me that's kind of you'd have too many people on the team. You're paying too many people. Why not have some of that built into each and every person on the team? How many people in your art classes are going to be artists? Like 1% of them, 0.5% of them? Mm-hmm. How many people in math class are going to be mathematicians? Same thing. And so it's no more or less necessary. Just like you're not, although you maybe sometimes have to fight for relevance and say this is really, really important for kids to have success in college and in life in a job that is outside of the arts. You have a little bit more probably of a job to do to convince people of that. But in reality, you are 1/3, if it's like math, science, and art, you're 1/3 of the equation of having a very well-thought, well-trained brain that can go into a situation, and although they may have one that's predominant, they are thinking across all aspects of their brain. And that's the people that I see being the most successful, not only in solving the business problem, which is important, but a lot of times it's managing the group of other individuals in the room. Yeah. and that also takes a very well-balanced brain, a brain that can think in a lot of different directions. And if someone's going off on a very strange tangent, let's say, being able to do the yes and drive them because you can see the passion in their eyes and your ability to notice that versus shutting them down or whatever, that is from, I believe, the creative side of your brain, not because the analytical side could quickly start to take their ideas and put numbers behind them and be like, that's not possible, why are we even talking about this? But if you see the passion and you can let them ride out the answer, doesn't mean you're going to do it, but it's really important. And as you get further and further in your career, it's less about finding the solution yourself. It's more about managing teams to be able to find the solution. And that it takes, to me, a balanced brain, and the art has to be translated to be 1/3 of that equation.
Yeah, art, I think there's two larger aspects to being involved in artists. One is that artists are makers. They make things, and we tend to focus a lot on the making of things in art education, but there's also an aspect that they have a unique way of thinking, which is kind of our message today. That unique way of thinking is part of what they can offer in the world. I mean, that's one of the unique things that they can do, and possibly crafting more content toward design thinking, artistic thinking, and the processes that come out of that, having the students realize that, and I have to remind my students all the time, oh, by the way, this is professional development. When can I get professional? You're doing professional development now. Well, something you might consider doing is you're thinking in a unique way right now, and it's the kind of thinking that is being sought after these days. So critical thinking in ambiguous terms, being able to think metaphorically, symbolically. This is what artists do. This is the way they think, and it's unique to the way that to the way they're taught.
I want to build on that. That's a great point. So I had a number of things written down, just things that I thought were transferable skills. I'm actually going to abandon all of them, and there's about 8, but we could talk later. But it's funny because I'm literally listening to a book right now called Deep Work by Cal Newton, and I am listening to it because in my transition to this new role that I mentioned, 3 months in, I'm struggling greatly to find something that's missing in my life that I had most of my life as a practicing artist, somebody who literally spent 3 or more hours a day in a state of flow. Flow is a form of deep work. It's where you shut everything else out and you are able to actually focus on one thing and one thing only and become an expert at it. If you think of Seth Godin, after 10,000 hours or whatever it is, but I got to put in my 3 a day. I haven't had that in a number of years, and I especially don't have it in this new gig. So it's been interesting to me to listen to this book and then to realize that you guys are in a unique position to share a story with your students. And that is that one of the premises of this book was that people who can engage in deep work actually will be amongst the most sought-after employees in the world, because we are increasingly a population of people that can no longer do deep work, not just because we're distracted by the internet and et cetera, but because of that, our brains are rewiring, and we have forgotten how to do deep work. And so to your point, Mark, that ability to get to the fact that your brain gets to work out that way means that you will bring that to anything you do. And now, of course, you need to remind them to hang on to that. And if they're not doing their art, they should do their work similarly, find that time. But they are learning how to do deep work. A lot of people don't as they grow up as digital natives. So I thought I'd share that instead of these other things.
Daniel Pink's book, The Whole New Mind, reiterates that, and maybe we'll make this the last thought and have some questions. But his book talks about who the power brokers have been throughout history, who owns, the world at certain points. And he's saying that right brain thinkers, storytellers, creative minds, those are the power brokers of the next era that he refers to as the knowledge era, and those are artists. Those are the people who he believes will be the next set of power brokers that'll be in the position of determining what's going to happen next.